The Great Chinese Famine, one of the deadliest events in modern history, remains largely overlooked by many. For years, it was hidden behind political agendas and government silence. But today, we're uncovering the dark truth behind a catastrophe that claimed the lives of up to 45 million people between 1959 and 1961. This is the story of how misguided policies, government denial, and a devastating famine turned one of the world's most populous nations into a land of unimaginable suffering. In the late 1950s, China was under the leadership of Mao Zedong, who had big dreams for his country. The Chinese Communist Party launched the Great Leap Forward in 1958, an ambitious plan to rapidly industrialize China and transform the country into an economic powerhouse. The idea was simple, yet terrifyingly flawed: collectivize agriculture and force farmers to work together on large communes. At the same time, millions of peasants were sent to work in the newly established steel production camps, leaving the fields abandoned. The government believed that collectivization would increase food production and allow for mass industrial growth. But in reality, the results were catastrophic. The government set unrealistic production targets and encouraged reporting false figures. Local officials inflated crop yields to meet these targets, leading to serious mismanagement and depletion of food stocks. By 1959, the first signs of famine were already emerging. The seeds of the famine were sown by a perfect storm of misguided policies. The first major issue was the collectivization itself. Farmers were now forced to give up their land and were assigned to large communal farms, where they had little incentive to produce food for themselves. The efficiency of traditional farming methods was lost, and crop yields plummeted. As droughts and floods ravaged parts of China in the late 1950s, the government responded not with aid, but with denial. The local authorities, who feared retribution from higher-ups in the Communist Party, continued to report inflated harvest figures, and famine was concealed as a local issue in certain areas. Food was redirected to cities and to export markets to maintain the illusion of prosperity, while rural populations starved. Meanwhile, those living in rural villages saw the fruits of their labor disappear. Families were forced to eat whatever they could find, including leaves, tree bark, and even rats. Starvation became widespread, and the famine spread from the countryside to the cities. But the government, gripped by the belief that China's future was secure, did not act. By 1960, it was clear that the famine was not just a temporary crisis, but an unprecedented disaster. It's estimated that between 15 to 45 million people died from hunger, disease, and malnutrition. Entire communities were wiped out, with some villages losing up to 80% of their population. Survivors have recounted horrific stories. Families scavenged for food in desperate conditions, and in some areas, cannibalism became tragically common. Disease, like cholera and dysentery, spread through the malnourished population, further compounding the tragedy. Despite the widespread suffering, the Chinese government did little to acknowledge the scale of the disaster. Mao Zedong's administration initially claimed that the famine was caused by natural disasters, not the government's policies. Local officials who reported the true extent of the famine were punished or sent to re-education camps. Mao's tight control over information meant that for years, the truth about the famine remained hidden from the world and even from most of the Chinese population. The government didn't fully admit the severity of the crisis until decades later, when survivors began to speak out and historians pieced together the true scale of the disaster. The Great Chinese Famine had a profound and lasting impact on China. Millions of lives were lost, and the damage to the country's agricultural infrastructure took years to repair. Many historians believe that the famine also significantly weakened Mao Zedong's credibility, leading to shifts in the political landscape and, eventually, his decline in power. Yet, despite the enormity of the tragedy, the famine remains a largely taboo subject in China to this day. Those who lived through it often remain reluctant to speak openly about their suffering, and official accounts continue to downplay the government's role. The Great Chinese Famine is a grim reminder of how political ambition and unchecked authority can lead to devastating consequences. Though it's a painful chapter in history, it's crucial that we continue to learn from it, so that we never repeat the same mistakes. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories about the hidden and forgotten events of history.